Hey, it's me, Tim, and I'm going to show you something a little bit different today. As you know, if you watch this channel, I mostly do commission custom builds, and so that means a lot of the time when I'm lucky, especially, I get asked to make things that don't really exist and that there aren't a lot of blueprints for, so to speak. And this instrument is no different. So what I'm going to show you in this video today is the actual sort of computer design process, if that interests you. And it's not just what's going on the computer, but it's also the thought process behind it. So, well, here, we'll just watch. What makes this guitar unique and fun is it's actually going to have 3 bass strings and 3 guitar strings. And of course, I'm not inventing this instrument. There are several manufacturers and players out there that play these sort of hybrid instruments. But I've only made one of these before. And like all builds, this starts with the most complicated math that you need to do for any guitar, which is like all of the fret layout. And this one's even more complicated, of course, because it has fanned frets, they call it, where there's multiple scale lengths. Each string is a slightly different scale length. But that website that I was showing you there at the beginning is a great place to start and just do all that math. It calculates it all for you, and it's especially useful with these complicated builds that have multiple scales. But the one thing that stinks about the way that website formats it is, you can see I have to go and actually create one line for each fret slot, because the way they come in, they're like segments, and it just makes it cleaner to cut it. So there's always a little bit of work to do afterwards, but knowing all that math is, to the thousandth of an inch for me is very useful. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to make sure, because of these strings are ranging in size so different, it's not just a matter of sort of equidistantly placing them down the center of the neck. I want to, based on the client's string spacing recommendations, I created these rectangles that are the actual thickness of the strings we're going to use, so I could really visualize how everything is going to fall on this instrument and the best way to sort of space these and how the hardware is going to fit. So this is definitely the most tedious part of the job. But then once I have all that figured out, I can start making it look like a guitar, which I'm doing here. Now this client likes my Apeiron bass shapes, and so I don't want to call this an Apeiron because it's being constructed a little bit differently than the way those are made. But I took the Apeiron bass body shape and I created this bolt-on neck version of it for this very specific neck, and to tweak some stuff here and there. But you can see there's probably better, faster ways to do this, but I like to really go in and micromanage a lot of these measurements and just get very specific with them here on the computer, to where I get specific to them within, like, beyond the tolerances of wood. So some of the stuff I'm doing is almost a waste of time, because if there's a 100th of an inch tolerance in wood, I'm working at the 1,000th. But that's my process, and I like to really understand it. And I think a lot of that is just, it sort of buys me time to think about what I might be missing and what I might be forgetting. So part of this build that's unique, of course, with the string spacing being so odd, I have to create a custom pickup for it. And also we wanted to create 2 outputs on this instrument. So you can have the low bass strings go to a bass amp and the guitar strings go to a guitar amp, but we also want to be able to just plug it into one amp and use it all at the same time. But we want it to look like one pickup. And so that's what I was doing there, is I was starting to lay out the framework of 2 pickups that look like one, which I'll then have to wind and put together under this case. And you can see there's a lot of really micromanaging, shapes and stuff. And then once I have all of my shapes figured out, I can start bringing them to life in 3-dimensional ways. Right now I'm creating different layers for all these different parts, which will just help me organize via color and also location on this screen where parts are. So like, for instance, I can make the strings disappear so I don't have to look at them anymore while I work on the neck. That's what's happening right now. And then I can make the body disappear while I'm working on the fingerboard. And the other cool thing about the sort of newer versions of Vectric software, which I'm using, I'm right up to date with the new version 12.5, which is awesome. It allows you to create multiple sheets in one file. So in the past, you would have had to have like a file for the neck and a file for the pickup. But here you can see I just zoomed out, and you can see I actually have all of those in one file. So I can jump from one to the other without having to open and close multiple sessions, so to speak. And that I find to be very, very useful when building complicated instruments like this that have a lot of parts that need to fit together. Just saves you a lot of time. So now at this point you can see I have all of my two-dimensional parts figured out. I've created some basic shapes to simulate hardware, and now I'm starting to, like I mentioned before, put them all in different layers, move them around to these different sheets so I can start actually figuring out how to cut out the two-dimensional parts that I need, like for this pickup, and also now create the three-dimensional shapes for like the guitar body and the neck and the fingerboard and all that stuff. I'm not getting into the specifics of the mechanics of this Vectric software here. If you go to Vectric's YouTube channel or their website, there's like all sorts of much better tutorials than I could squeeze into this guitar build video. But you can see what I'm doing here is I'm taking my two-dimensional shapes and basically the parts like the headstock and the tail, I'm just extruding out to make them three-dimensional shapes. But then on the neck, I'm applying what's called a two-rail sweep. And that is helping me create the radius of the shape of the neck. I create the geometry that I want to apply to these two rails, and then I add them to it, and that's how I get that sort of half round shape. And then of course I have to figure out how I'm going to cut all this stuff out on my CNC router, and so that's what I'm doing now is I'm creating tool paths. So some of the three-dimensional shapes are actually sort of faked by just the way where I cut holes and pockets and stuff. So it's not like modeling with like a 3D printer where you would create the shape and then cut it out. I want to do it in stages to make it as efficient and make everything work as easily as possible. And I get to preview it, which is great. So like you can see here on the body, I'm actually not doing any 3D cuts at all on this. They're all two-dimensional cuts. Even the belly cut and the arm cut are what's called a molding profile. And so it's like a sort of a cheating way to create a 3D cut in two-dimensional stuff. Now the fingerboard, I did apply a two-rail sweep because it has a compound radius, but then all those belly cuts and stuff, that's all two-dimensional cuts, so it's like way faster than trying to cut out the model of that body, which I do still have to do with the neck and the fingerboard. But before I cut any of this stuff out on expensive and time-consuming wood, I want to look at it in the real world in its real proper size. So that's where the laser really comes in handy. And I just use some cardboard and cut out two-dimensional versions of all these parts and make sure they all fit together and they scale out right. I can, check all my measurements. I can see how the hardware actually fits on it in the real world. I can actually, even like simulate strings running up and down it to just make sure I'm happy with what I've created. And also I can share this with the client now to make sure they're happy with what I created. I also had to figure out all this wiring stuff before I start building it and make sure I can do what the client wants. That was a mess, but I figured it out. And I then also need to search for the right materials. So, I only use reclaimed and locally sourced materials. So here I am, I always start with what's under my CNC router because that's the stuff that's already been sort of processed down a little bit. And a lot of times I'll find pieces that are already exactly the size I need. And then if that doesn't work, I go back into my heavier stock here and I start cutting out the pieces I need, and in this case, for the client's build, we are doing a maple neck and fingerboard and a maple top on a locally sourced copper beech is what I'm milling there right now. And the maple's all local too. So that's all the stuff that happens usually before I turn the camera on, and I thought I'd share that with you a little bit this time because it's, kind of interesting. And so now, I've made physical sort of templates of the things that I'm going to actually be cutting so I can touch them and problem solve. I've got most of the hardware in stock. I've started designing the hardware that I'm going to make, and I'm touching and feeling all these parts, and that really helps me take what's happening on the computer and bring it into the real world, which is what I will do in the next video. I'm going to show you how I made it for real, like my usual stuff. All right, see you then. Be good.